There are moments in the bold and the beautiful when a character's emotional unraveling does not announce itself with a dramatic collapse, but instead reveals itself through a slow, almost imperceptible shift in perception. A gradual distortion of reality that begins with hurt and quietly evolves into something far more dangerous. And that is precisely where RJ now stands, at the edge of transformation that no one around him fully recognizes until it is already too late. Because what begins as heartbreak, as frustration, as the familiar ache of rejection, does not remain contained within those boundaries. It grows, it reshapes itself, it searches for meaning and justification, and in doing so, it begins to rewrite the narrative of his own life, turning him from a young man who simply wanted to be loved into someone who believes he has been denied something that rightfully belongs to him. And that belief, once it takes hold, becomes the foundation for everything that follows. At first, the signs are subtle, almost easy to dismiss, especially in the aftermath of his confrontation with Ridge Forrester, whose stern warning about professionalism and emotional control leaves RJ feeling not only reprimanded but diminished, as though his feelings have been reduced to a liability, something to be managed rather than understood. And this moment plants a seed of resentment that does not immediately surface as anger, but instead settles into a quiet determination to prove himself, to demonstrate that his emotions are not a weakness but a source of clarity, that he sees something others refuse to acknowledge. And this need to validate his own perspective becomes the lens through which he begins to interpret everything that happens next, particularly his interactions with Electra and Will, because in his mind, the situation is no longer about two people trying to navigate a complicated relationship. It becomes a test of worthiness, a question of who deserves Electra more. And once that question takes hold, it becomes increasingly difficult for him to accept any outcome that does not place him at the center. This is where the transition begins, where jealousy, once a fleeting emotion, starts to solidify into something more persistent, more structured, as RJ begins to act not just in response to what he feels, but in pursuit of a narrative he has constructed, one in which he is the overlooked choice, the one who has been patient, supportive, consistent, while Will represents chaos, inconsistency, and emotional harm. And this binary framing allows RJ to justify actions that might otherwise feel questionable, because in his mind, he is not interfering, he is correcting an imbalance, restoring a sense of fairness that has been disrupted by circumstances beyond his control. And at first, these actions remain within the realm of impulsive behavior, subtle attempts to undermine Will's credibility, to position himself as the more reliable alternative, to create moments where Electra might begin to see him differently. But as these efforts fail to produce the desired outcome, as Electra continues to hesitate, continues to hold on to something that RJ cannot fully understand, his behavior begins to escalate, driven by a growing frustration that cannot be resolved through simple persistence. What makes this escalation particularly compelling is the way it is reinforced by the very forces that should be containing it. Because Brooke, in her attempt to protect her son, begins to validate his perspective in ways that unintentionally deepen his obsession, offering reassurance that he is deserving, that he is being overlooked, that his feelings are justified. And while her intentions are rooted in love, the effect is to strengthen the narrative RJ has already begun to build, to confirm that he is not imagining the injustice he perceives, but is in fact a victim of it. And this validation becomes a catalyst, transforming his internal conflict into a sense of purpose, a belief that he must act not only for himself, but to correct a wrong that others refuse to acknowledge. And in this way, Brooke's support, rather than grounding him, begins to push him further away from reality, because it removes the last barrier between his emotions and his actions, allowing him to move forward without the hesitation that might otherwise have slowed his descent. At the same time, Electra's position becomes increasingly precarious, as she finds herself caught between two versions of reality that are becoming harder to reconcile. Because while she continues to struggle with the emotional aftermath of her relationship with Will, Influenced by the manipulation she has yet to fully uncover, she also begins to sense a shift in RJ, a subtle but undeniable change in the way he looks at her, the way he speaks to her, the way his presence feels less like support and more like expectation. And this shift creates a new kind of tension, one that is not rooted in past hurt, but in present discomfort, as Electra begins to realize that the safety she once associated with RJ is no longer guaranteed, that his feelings, while genuine, are becoming something more intense, more consuming, something that demands a response rather than offering a choice. And this realization forces her into a position she has been trying to avoid, where she can no longer rely on others to define her path, where she must confront the reality of her situation and begin to assert her own agency, even if doing so means risking further conflict. Meanwhile, Will's role in this unfolding dynamic becomes increasingly significant, not because he is free from fault, but because his presence serves as a constant challenge to the narrative RJ is constructing, and as their confrontations become more direct, more charged. The underlying tension that has been building between them finally surfaces in ways that can no longer be ignored, culminating in moments of physical conflict that are as much about emotion as they are about control. Because in these encounters, RJ is not simply fighting Will. He is fighting the version of himself that feels inadequate, the part of him that fears he will never be enough, and this internal battle manifests externally, creating a volatile dynamic that threatens to spiral beyond the boundaries of what any of them can manage. It is within this escalating conflict that the true stakes of a storyline begin to emerge, because what started as a love triangle has evolved into something far more dangerous. A situation in which one character's inability to accept reality is creating consequences that extend far beyond his own experience, affecting everyone around him in ways that are both immediate and potentially irreversible. And as RJ continues to move further away from the person he once was, the question is no longer whether he will succeed in winning Electra's affection, but how far he is willing to go in pursuit of that goal, and what he is willing to sacrifice along the way. For Brooke, this progression becomes increasingly difficult to ignore as the gap between her intentions and the reality of RJ's behavior grows wider, forcing her to confront the possibility that her support has contributed to a situation she can no longer control. And this realization introduces a new layer of conflict within her, as she must decide whether to continue defending her son at all costs or to acknowledge the harm he is causing and take steps to intervene, even if doing so means betraying the very instinct that has guided her actions thus far. And this decision is not a simple one, because it requires her to redefine what it means to protect him, to consider the possibility that true protection may involve allowing him to face the consequences of his actions rather than shielding him from them. At the center of it all, Electra emerges as the character whose journey carries the most profound transformation, because as the external forces around her intensify, she is forced to turn inward, to question everything she has been told, everything she has believed, and to begin the difficult process of reclaiming her own voice, her own perspective, her own sense of agency. And this process is neither immediate nor easy, but it is essential because in a world where so many people are trying to define her choices, the only way forward is for her to define them herself, to step out of the narratives that have been imposed upon her and into a reality that she can trust, even if that reality is more complicated, more uncertain, and more painful than anything she has known before. In the end, the evolution of RJ from a wounded young man into a genuine threat is not simply a plot development, but a reflection of how easily vulnerability can be transformed into something destructive when it is left unchecked, when it is reinforced rather than challenged, and when the line between love and entitlement becomes blurred. And as the story continues to unfold, the consequences of this transformation will ripple outward, shaping not only the fate of the characters involved, but the emotional core of the narrative itself. As each of them is forced to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest danger does not come from external forces, but from the parts of ourselves we refuse to question. The shift does not happen all at once, and that is precisely what makes it so unsettling. Because in the bold and the beautiful, the most dangerous transformations are never loud, never obvious, but instead unfold in quiet, deliberate steps that only reveal their full weight when it is already too late to undo them. And RJ's descent continues along that same path, deepening not through sudden violence, but through a tightening grip on a reality he has begun to reshape in his own image. A reality where every rejection is reinterpreted as interference, every obstacle as proof of conspiracy, and every moment of doubt as something imposed on him rather than something that originates within. And as this perception solidifies, the line between what he feels and what he believes becomes increasingly blurred, until the two are indistinguishable, until his emotions no longer simply inform his actions, but justify them entirely. At first, his behavior still carries the outward appearance of restraint, as if some part of him is still aware of the boundaries he once respected, but those boundaries begin to erode in subtle ways. Through small decisions that seem insignificant in isolation, but collectively signal a profound shift. The way he lingers longer than necessary, the way his presence becomes less about support and more about proximity, about ensuring that he is always there, always visible, always impossible to ignore. And this persistence begins to create a new kind of pressure on Electra, one that is not as overt as Ivy's manipulation, but no less impactful, because it removes the space she needs to think, to breathe, to process her own emotions without influence. And as that space disappears, so too does her sense of control, replaced by a growing awareness that the people around her are no longer simply reacting to her choices, but actively shaping the environment in which those choices are made. What makes RJ's transformation particularly dangerous is the way it feeds on itself. The way each perceived slight reinforces the narrative he has constructed, pushing him further into a mindset where he no longer sees himself as someone pursuing love, but as someone reclaiming something that has been unjustly taken from him. And this shift in perspective changes everything because it removes the possibility of acceptance, of moving on, of recognizing that not all desires can be fulfilled, and instead replaces it with a sense of entitlement that demands resolution, that insists on an outcome where he is not only chosen, but vindicated, and this insistence begins to manifest in more direct confrontations, particularly with Will, whose presence becomes increasingly intolerable to RJ. Not because of what he does, but because of what he represents, the embodiment of everything RJ believes is standing in his way. And when their interactions escalate into physical conflict, it is no longer simply a clash of personalities, but the external expression of an internal war that RJ is losing, a war between the person he was and the person he is becoming. Meanwhile, Electra finds herself at the center of a storm that is no longer defined by confusion alone, but by a growing sense of urgency, a realization that the dynamics around her have shifted in ways that are no longer safe, no longer manageable through patience or silence. Because the emotional tension that once existed as an internal struggle has now taken on a physical presence, a tangible weight that she can feel in every interaction, every glance, every moment where she senses that the people around her are no longer simply asking for her affection, but expecting it, demanding it, shaping their actions around the assumption that her choice is something to be influenced rather than respected. And this realization forces her into a position she has been resisting, where she must confront not only her feelings for Will and RJ, but the reality that she cannot rely on either of them to define her path, that the responsibility for her own safety, her own future, ultimately rests with her alone. At the same time, Brooke's role becomes increasingly complicated as she begins to see the consequences of the path she has helped set in motion. Because while her initial intention was to empower her son, to give him the confidence and presence he lacked, she cannot ignore the changes in him. The intensity that has replaced his vulnerability, the determination that no longer feels grounded in love, but in something far more rigid and uncompromising. And this shift forces Brooke into a painful reckoning with herself, as she begins to question whether her guidance has crossed a line. Whether in trying to give RJ strength, she has instead stripped away the very qualities that once made him capable of genuine connection, and this realization creates a fracture within her. A tension between the instinct to protect her son at all costs and the growing awareness that protecting him may now require confronting him, challenging him, even opposing him in ways she never imagined she would have to. Yet even as Brooke begins to pull back, to reconsider her influence, the momentum of RJ's transformation proves difficult to contain because the narrative he has built is no longer dependent on external validation. It sustains itself, fueled by his own interpretation of events, by the belief that he is misunderstood, that others are blind to the truth he sees so clearly, and this self-sustaining logic makes him increasingly resistant to intervention, to reason, to any perspective that contradicts his own. And as this resistance grows, so too does the sense of inevitability that surrounds him, the feeling that he is moving towards something that cannot be easily stopped, a breaking point that looms closer with each passing moment. In contrast, Will's presence becomes more grounded, more focused, as if the chaos around him has forced him into a clarity he did not previously possess. And while he remains flawed, still driven by emotion, still struggling to fully understand the forces at play, there is a sincerity in his actions that stands in stark contrast to the escalating intensity of RJ's behavior. And this contrast becomes increasingly important, not because it simplifies the situation, but because it highlights the divergence between two paths, one rooted in acceptance and growth, the other in control and escalation. And as Electra observes this divergence, she begins to see more clearly the choices before her, not just between two men, but between two fundamentally different approaches to love and agency. It is within this growing clarity that Electra's transformation begins to take shape, not as a sudden act of defiance, but as a gradual reclaiming of her voice, her perspective, her right to define her own experiences, and this reclaiming is both empowering and terrifying, because it requires her to step outside the narratives that have been imposed upon her, to question the assumptions she has accepted, to confront the possibility that she has been influenced in ways she did not recognize, and to take responsibility for the decisions she must now make. Decisions that will not satisfy everyone, that will inevitably create conflict, but that will at least be her own. As the tension continues to build, the relationships that once defined the story begin to fracture under the weight of these changes. Alliances shifting, loyalties tested, and the sense of impending tragedy becoming impossible to ignore, because the forces at play are no longer balanced, no longer contained within the boundaries of emotional conflict, but moving towards something more volatile, more unpredictable. And in this environment, the question is no longer whether a breaking point will be reached, but what form that breaking point will take, and who will be left standing in its aftermath. In the end, RJ's evolution into a genuine threat is not defined by a single moment, but by the accumulation of choices, perceptions, and influences that have gradually reshaped him, turning vulnerability into obsession, turning desire into entitlement. And as the story moves forward, the consequences of that transformation will continue to unfold, not only for him, but for everyone caught in the path of a reality he has refused to let go of, a reality that grows more fragile, more dangerous, with each